Ain Taha is a researcher based in the Netherlands and Singapore. With a background in Asian studies and the arts, she interrogates material culture with a focus in diplomatic gifting during colonial times and its unmistakable role defining power relations. She has worked as program maker for the Malay Heritage Center in Singapore and now dedicates her time for programs with a strong basis in community-curated materials. Recently, she graduated cum laude from the University of Leiden with her work analyzing the life of the royal coach Kanyang Nyai Yimat.
First and foremost, thank you, Charlotte, for the introduction. So the topic that I'm going to talk about today is the idea of decolonizing the Pusaka, or sacred objects, which we can identify either as a booty or as diplomatic gifts in and out of museum isolation. Throughout the whole conference today, we have looked at how colonization as well as the idea of violence have manifested themselves through artworks as well as various situations or events in the community itself, whether it be in the Netherlands or in Indonesia itself. But what I would like to focus here is actually on looking at objects as manifestation of colonization and also of violence itself. One of the things that most of us will be familiar with is the idea of museums. And usually when we go to museums, it's really to look at artifacts that are seen as perhaps out of the world, as something that is very important. Also, the value of the artifacts themselves, because they are of very high economic value. And hence, there is a need to look at them and also to admire them behind glass displays and also behind barricades. But when we look at museums, we have to understand that the basis of museums is a house of collections of artifacts and objects. That is the main idea of the museum and how it is being made. And what I would like to look at here is actually how European imperialism is actually a significant process that shaped the modern world and its devastating consequences that it still has up till today, and how this actually becomes manifested in the institution of the museum itself. Some of the devastating consequences of colonialism itself actually includes violent extraction of resources, including material culture, precious objects, natural resources, as well as exploitation of human resources, and the list of atrocities goes on. This, of course, is not limited to just the Netherlands, but also many European counterparts. The functions of museums during the 18th to 19th century were actually mainly used as active tools of empire. Museums, I guess, can be viewed in a way as a house of exploits of the empires, showcasing not only the histories of the people, the memories, narratives, stories, lives, cultures, colonization, as well as exploits and violence. Recent debates when we talk about the museum is the idea of the need to decolonize it, because there is a need to decolonize the history, the museums, and the collections. This idea of decolonization of European museums and creating a decolonial framework as previous countries with the status of colonizers grapple with the history of their dark past and the atrocities committed is an issue that has been debated for more than 2 decades. Admittedly, the pressure to do so has actually intensified over recent years, with the topic being ever so present in not only museum debates, conferences and talks, but also as part of the museum action plans. The debate over this decolonization of museums and their collections have a lot of ties to the decolonizing of history of imperialism. Museum collections, as highlighted previously, are actually a product of colonization and plays a big portion in representing the history of colonization itself. So, in decolonizing the history, museums, and their collections, we really need to ask ourselves, where did the where did the artifacts actually come from? How were they acquired? And what is actually the social life history of these objects beyond the context of the museums? In my presentation, I have decided to focus on two categories of artifacts that we can find in the museums, both in the Netherlands and also in Indonesia. So as Charlotte had initially introduced at the start of the talk today, is the idea of the booty or the spoils of war. Basically, these were artifacts that were taken forcefully from Indonesia, and they are still kept within the collections of the Dutch museums up till today. Most of the times, objects such as the spoils of war or looted from Indonesia, they were actually displayed as trophies to showcase how they had been attained and also to showcase the power that is attained by the colonizers. These are some of the gifts that were exchanged between the Dutch authorities and also local traditional rulers in the Dutch East Indies. So gifts were actually exchanged and they hold various embedded meanings, culturally as well as politically and economically. The exchange of gifts itself is very intentional on both sides, and they are not to be seen only just as objects that are transported across the globe. They were purposefully exchanged across cultural and political boundaries, and in the process of exchanging these gifts, it actually forms early modern connections that provides us with a deeper understanding of the negotiations and the power structures that took place during the colonial times. Here we can actually see that most of the items, they are either grand or they are made of gold to show that there is a lot of economic value that were taken into consideration when one gives items that are to be exchanged between two political powers. In decolonizing the collections of museums, there is also a need to look at categories of artifacts, not just within the Western context. To look at them as just booty or as gifts is to limit the idea of their social lives. If we take a look and put them into the context of local categorizations, such as Pusaka, for example, which means the sacred heirlooms, there's a lot more to the social life of the objects that we look at than what is being shared in captions in museums, for example. So Pusaka or sacred heirlooms are actually tangible and intangible. Tangible meaning they can be objects that we can see and touch, but also intangible in a way that they might be songs, mantras, or even dances that is not easily touched or easily comprehensible in a way. Pusaka itself are believed to be sacred objects that possess good luck or could potentially bring good luck to those who possess it, and usually, and not necessarily so, is inherited from one generation to the other, and is also a symbol of the inner strength of those who possess it. Within the Javanese cosmology itself, Pusaka is actually understood as sacred objects that has the inner strength, and for those who possess it, they actually increase the power not only physically, but also spiritually. One other way to actually acknowledge the cultural significance of the Pusaka and why it is so important is because it allows us to understand the multiple meanings that have been attached to these objects, not just within the context of those who managed to possess it, but also in the context of the community who used to own it. There is a lot of agency in the objects that are considered as Pusaka, and this needs to be explored further. So why booty and gifts and looking at them as Pusaka? Booty or gifts are actually very politically charged objects and also culturally charged objects. So to start the process of decolonization itself, there needs to be a proactive identification, interrogation, deconstruction, and replacement of hierarchies of power that replicate the colonial structures itself, or within this context, the museum and their collections. To do so, we need to include or empower previously excluded voices and generate conversations and debates within the sector itself. But this is, of course, harder to define, especially when it involves the idea of decolonizing, and if it is within the museum praxis, because there is actually no consensus across the museum sectors as to how one should actually approach this topic. One of the methods that they have actually proposed is to actually consider object approaches to experiences of the empire, which means we look at objects and have an object-focused analysis to actually unravel the history of the colonial past. When we look at booty and gifts as pusaka or sacred heirlooms, it is the idea of them being sacred that gives them the politically charged or culturally charged agencies. A lot of the booty, especially if you look at the Rijksmuseum, for example, it actually comes from the category of the LOMBOK treasure. And actually, when we display the booty or items that were looted from Bali and Lombok, it actually tells the history of violence itself that took place within the colonial times. The historical background of the Dutch and Bali encounters is actually revealing of their political relationship, which was actually marked by hostility and tension. With the Dutch aggressive military expedition in the late 1800s, many Balinese kingdoms actually succumbed to the PUPUTAN, or the mass killing suicide, to save their pride from being ruled by the Dutch. So the local idea of PUPUTAN itself is actually an embedded idea of violence within the local context. It means to fight to the death instead of surrendering, in this case for the Balinese, instead of surrendering to the Dutch, and it is a traditional method of mass killing suicide. This is a very common occurrence within the Balinese states during the Dutch aggressive expeditions, because the Balinese kings would rather kill themselves and the whole royal family, as well as their followers, rather than submit their allegiance to the Dutch. This is actually an illustration of the first PUPUTAN that took place by the Raja Buleleng in Bali itself. So the Raja actually killed himself in the infamous PUPUTAN with the rest of his followers instead of surrendering himself to the Dutch. So during the Dutch military expedition of 1849, that was when the first PUPUTAN actually took place. And it actually took 2 more military expeditions before the Dutch entirely brought down northern Bali under its rule in 1882. Subsequent PUPUTANs also took place in the kingdoms of Badung and Denpasar in 1906 and in Klungkung in 1908, when the Raja of Klungkung actually refused to submit to the Dutch. As can be seen in this picture, the masses of body in white is actually a clear depiction of what a mass killing suicide is actually like. So this actually took place in Badung, whereby the royal family, led by the Raja himself, went out in their own parade towards the Dutch military and then proceeded to kill themselves with the traditional weapons of the keris, which is usually also considered as a pusaka. So here in the background, we can actually just see the soldiers from the Dutch military expedition overlooking the masses of body. So after the PUPUTAN, the corpse of the ruler of Badung was actually carried to the palace. And what usually proceeds after the PUPUTAN is that the Dutch military expeditions or the Dutch military groups would proceed to invade the various palaces of the Balinese kings and take away all precious items, be it royal paraphernalia, pusaka, heirlooms, and even textiles, anything of economic value were actually taken away from the palaces. So for the case of Bali and Lombok, one of the most infamous category was actually the Lombok treasure, which is still within the Rijksmuseum and the Volkenkunde Museum's collections. It was actually believed that more than 250 kilos of silver and countless jewels, as well as precious stones, were taken away as part of the war booty. And part of this has been returned back to Indonesia, but a lot of the collections are still within the museums in the Netherlands itself. Items that were taken away as war booty, such as this golden keris hilt, for example, were first and foremost seen as objects that possess economic value to the Dutch. However, there are also objects or articles of significant cultural value, especially royal regalia or Pusaka of the Balinese royal families, who were also taken away as a symbol of submission to the Dutch. Here, there are actually a few examples of war booty that were taken away. As we can see in all three examples of artifacts, they are actually made of gold and embedded with precious stones. Here, what I would like to highlight is that something that is very distinctive of artifacts or Pusaka that comes from the Balinese royal families is that they like to embed it with precious stones such as rubies, and this can be seen in a lot of artifacts that are still within the possession of the museums, be it in Indonesia or the Netherlands. One of the most important artifacts or Pusaka that the Dutch proceeded to take away from the Balinese palaces is actually the keris, or the traditional weapon that is usually used within the Nusantara context. First and foremost, a lot of the royal heirlooms such as the keris were taken away because they had very high economic value. There were actually mentions in several colonial newspapers of the high economic value that they possess, where some were actually appraised at 10,000 guilders each. For the Balinese, on the other hand, they were of distinctive cultural value because they were described in both official and unofficial accounts with terms like supernatural and holy. Within the context of the Balinese cosmology itself, kerises such as this are usually possessed by the rajas or the kings of Bali. So in a way, they are representative in a tangible way, the power and also the magic and the supernatural world that the Balinese believed in. The keris were actually given special notice by the Dutch, at least in their preliminary reports. In the reports that were submitted in the archives itself, it actually noted that the Dutch expeditions had to search or hunt for certain kerises because they were seen to be potentially supernatural or possessing the power, and they need to be taken away in order to prevent another uprising by the Balinese kingdoms. The hilt on the first image, for example, it remains just as a hilt in the Rijksmuseum and currently on display, but usually it would have been attached to a silver blade, but had somehow been separated. And usually the hilts of the keris are also carved with faces of gods and demons because they represent as the protectors of the person who actually possesses it. So the idea of keris as something that is sacred, as a pusaka that possess supernatural powers, is not actually just a belief that exists within the Balinese community itself, but within the Dutch colonizers during that time. Part of them also believed that there must be some kind of power associated to these objects, and there is a need to put them under hostage within the Dutch possession. This was actually a quote that was included in one of the newspapers in the Locomotive, whereby they believed that the Balinese Chris actually possess magical powers, and some are believed to cause earthquakes or could cause a person to immediately fall down to the earth dead, or even make someone remain immobile in the position he had at the moment when it is being pointed at him. So in a way, the idea of supernatural abilities or spiritual spirits and such that is being possessed by the Pusaka as objects, although it might seem to exist within just the Balinese cosmology, it is also being reported in various Western sources as well. Because the keris and other Pusaka objects were considered dangerous cultural artifacts, they needed to be possessed and held hostage by the Dutch within the context of museums or even within the private collections. So by looking at the artifacts within the local categorization of them as Pusaka, it actually gives us a deeper understanding of the social life of these looted items, that they are not just inanimate objects, but also potentially animated supernatural objects that exist within just not the Balinese community, but beyond that as well. Another interesting artifact is actually gifts, and what I would like to focus on is this particular gift that is considered a Pusaka, but it does not exist, is not within the context of the Western Museum. This is the case of the Kanjeng Nyai Jimat, and is actually still on display in the Yogyakarta Kraton or the Royal Palace Museum. So during the colonial period itself, many diplomatic gifts were actually exchanged between the Dutch and the local East Indies rulers, and they were objects that were seen and categorized mostly as Pusaka. Of a particular interest is actually this coach, which was sent by the Dutch to the first Sultan of Yogyakarta, Sultan Hamengkubuwono I. A royal carriage is actually the first of its kind, which is now housed in the Royal Carriage Museum and is only taken out once a year to be displayed to the public. When we observe the coach itself, there's really nothing much of significance to it. It looks like any other old coach or traditional coaches that we could actually find in the collections of museums in Europe itself. So here we can actually see that the coach is made of gold gilded, and is actually indicative of just a single rider. So when this was still in use, it was only rode by the Sultan of Yogyakarta itself. The coach became especially important within the concept of the Javanese cosmology because it's believed to be possessed by the spirit of the RATU Nyi Roro Kidul, which is also the Queen of the Southern Sea. She's a spiritual figure that is highly associated with the Royal Kraton in Yogyakarta, and is also believed to be able to control the area of Yogyakarta itself. Just a closer look at the coach itself. It's actually painted in red with a lot of floral ornaments, and the base of the coach is believed to be of tropical wood, and the ornaments on it were actually reminiscent of furniture owned by the Dutch East Indies Company. And what is of particular importance, especially within the Javanese community, is this figure of the female on the footboard itself, which is believed to be where the spirit of the Queen of the Southern Sea resides in. So this is an illustration of what the mystical Ratu Kidul or Queen of the Southern Sea might look like. The idea of imbuing carvings or ornaments such as the female figure in the Javanese belief is actually associated to the goddess herself, and it is actually similar to the Western idea of fixing figureheads on ships to protect the people on the ship itself. So the culmination of this mystical Ratu KIDUL within the context of the coach itself is a very popular idea because people believe that her existence within the Pusaka or the coach itself, it could protect not only the king, but also the state of Java, while lending some kind of mystical authority to the Javanese rulers. So the king, by making the coach, which is quite obviously a European product, into a Pusaka, he actually makes this connection with the supernatural world and therefore provides another expression of the difference which lies between him and his subjects. In a way, the king actually managed to provide agency for himself through the product of the coach by making it into a Pusaka so that this could provide more legitimacy to his power within the Javanese cosmology. If you take a look at the female carving, the features themselves are actually quite European in a way, and they could easily be found in various European furnitures, such as the one on the right. And further look into it, the other two photos on the right, they are actually from the catalogue of new designs for ornamenting and embellishing coaches and carriages, which was produced in the 1600s. So when we take a look at the cross comparison, the female figure on the coach of Nyanyi Kanjeng Jimat itself is actually very similar to proposed designs that are used as part of designing coaches within the European context. What is interesting about the coach itself is also the fact that instead of just artifacts that are being displayed behind closed doors or behind protected barriers such as glass displays, the Pusaka or the artifact itself is actually a living one in a way that it is still involved and very much participating in the rituals of the Javanese community up till today. The mysticality of Kanjeng Nyanyi Jimat and its position as a very sacred artifact belonging to the royal family or within the Javanese society is practiced and reinforced annually through the process of rituals. This includes the siraman or the ritual cleansing, where various servants of the royal family actually takes part in cleaning the Pusaka or the coach itself. On this day, the coach is actually brought out into the public to be cleansed by the Abdi Dalam or the royal servants of the Kraton. And the ritual of the siraman is accompanied by various sets of strict protocols and rules for those in charge of purifying it. For example, those who are in charge of cleaning the coach have to fast for several days to purify themselves before they are allowed to carry out their duties. On the day of the siraman itself, or the cleansing ritual, believers of the sacred potency of Kanjeng Nyanyi Jimat actually rush in to ngalap berkah or to seek blessings. So it's not just the idea of being able to see it, but being able to participate and consume products from the ritual cleansing itself is something that is very much still alive within the Javanese context. A lot of the people would actually come in with bottles and containers to collect the water, the wastewater that was used to purify or to cleanse the coach itself, because they believe that the water that has been used actually is sacred and has healing abilities. So some of the believers use the wastewater, as we can see in this photo, to pour it over their bodies, believing that it will get rid of their illnesses. And various other people even use it to water their paddy fields because they believe that it has the magical properties or the potency to actually make their paddy fields or the bounty of their crops a lot more bountiful over the season itself. So the participation of the siraman or the ritual processes is not just something as a spectacle to be participated or to be proactively done by the royal family, but also by the community and by the community within the Javanese society, and also those beyond it. So by looking at this, we can actually see that to extend the idea of artifacts within museums, not just within the categories or within the fixed categories that have been defined by museums, and to look at them as other categories of objects in traditional context. It actually reveals a lot about the various social lives of objects, and not just as them as being inanimated within institutions itself. Because when we look at objects, be it the booties or the diplomatic gifts as Pusaka, it actually reveals a lot about the power relations that exist within those authorities that participated in it, and as well as the agencies that actually are possessed by the artifacts themselves within the exchanges that took place, and also the system of beliefs, rituals, and ceremonies that involves not just those in power, but also it extends to the community and the commoners, who are actually the people who provides the basis of the power. So I believe that in the context of decolonizing museums, collections, and also ultimately the history of those entangled in the dark history of colonizers and the colonized, there is also a need to look at artifacts or objects that we possess, and to look at them through various lenses in order to give a more fair or even a more animated life history.